Funding for Marriage Amendment I Do, I Don't has been provided by the Bush Foundation.
Minnesota, do you or don't you?
We are sick and tired of people who don't have their principles burned into their psyche and their souls.
We are going to show Minnesota who we are.
This November, voters across the state will have the final say on a new constitutional amendment to define marriage.
I think the amendment can be confusing if people don't really do their homework.
Tonight, join us as we explore what some are calling one of the most critical social issues of our time.
Both sides see the stakes in this battle as enormous.
See how each campaign is reaching out to voters and find out what's drawing churches into the political arena.
It'll be polygamy next, it'll be group marriage next.
We don't have to agree or disagree on the morality or the sinfulness or lack thereof of homosexuality.
Find out how the battle is shaping up in greater Minnesota, where a growing gay and lesbian population is testing the waters of acceptance.
And it's actually a lot more comfortable for us now.
And you'll meet some Minnesota families who say what happens in November matters.
I don't believe that my faith is something that I can stick in a box and limit to Sunday morning.
I'd frankly love to have a better understanding of what they're concerned about.
Marriage Amendment, I Do, I Don't, is next.
On November 6th, Minnesotans will go to the polls. Besides choosing candidates for president, Senate, and Congress, Minnesotans can also decide two constitutional amendments. One is the heated question of whether a definition of marriage should be part of our state constitution. The battle for and against has been both bitter and long since lawmakers decided to put it on the ballot more than a year ago. Tonight, we're dedicating the next hour to a thoughtful conversation, exploring what's going on in Minnesota, why it matters, and what Minnesotans are feeling and saying about this proposed change to our state's constitution. Illustrator David Gillette outlines the issue before us.
Okay, the marriage amendment. Tough issue and a lot of strong opinions. Here are some of the facts. In May 2011, the Minnesota legislature passed Senate File 1308, a bill that proposes an amendment to the state constitution defining marriage as between one man and one woman. On November 6, 2012, you'll be asked to vote yes or no on whether this amendment should be ratified. Constitutional amendments are not new. In recent years, Minnesotans have said yes to amendments supporting natural resources, arts and culture, repairing highways, and preserving our hunting and fishing heritage. Minnesotans have also said no to an amendment allowing off-track wagering on horse racing. Bottom line, some are adopted, some are rejected. In order to reach the ballot, an amendment must be supported by the majority of lawmakers in both the Minnesota House and Senate. But unlike a normal piece of legislation, the governor can't sign or veto an amendment proposal because it goes straight to the voters. Next, to become part of the Constitution, an amendment must receive a yes vote from over half of all the people who cast a ballot. If you leave the question blank, you will be registered as a no vote. So in that sense, there's no neutral position on a ballot question. If approved, the definition of marriage as being between one man and one woman will be added to our Constitution and can only be removed through the same process. So there you have it. Just the basics on Senate File 1308.
This may seem like a simple case of being for and against marriage, but we discovered this debate has divided Minnesotans in unexpected ways.
Supporters and opponents launched two major campaigns since lawmakers approved putting the proposed marriage amendment on the November ballot. Minnesotans for Marriage, representing a pro-amendment coalition of conservative groups and conservative churches, most notably the Minnesota Catholic Conference and the Catholic Church. And Minnesotans United for All Families, spawned by local and national gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender groups, which has grown to become a coalition of more than 600 organizations.
Most Minnesotans still believe that marriage is between one man and one woman.
Minnesota doesn't want to be a state. That ends this conversation early.
This is one political battle that doesn't track strictly along party lines.
The battle's shaping up along some interesting dimensions, some of it in terms of demographics, some of it in terms of religion, some of it in terms of really ideology.
For example, you would typically think of the African American community as being liberal or voting with the Democratic point of view, but in this case, overwhelmingly they're supporting the traditional definition of marriage. On the other side, you have young Republicans who are going to vote no on the amendment.
In this battle, many of Minnesota's religious groups are front and center, saying they view the marriage amendment question as critically important to their particular faith. Many are working hard to educate church members.
People have asked, why would you talk about a political issue? Well, in reality, I think it is a theological issue that's gotten politicized.
Troy Dobbs is senior pastor at Grace Church in Eden Prairie, an evangelical church that draws 4,000 to 5,000 congregants every Sunday.
God is the one who's designed marriage, and therefore he gets to define it, and then he has defined it as a covenant between a man and a woman. I think if you go down this road of redefining marriage, you've opened the floodgates. It'll be polygamy next, it'll be group marriage next. I don't know where it will stop.
In this case, what we are seeing are people using a particular view of Scripture and theology to try to come to a particular outcome in legislation and especially our Constitution, which does discriminate against a group of citizens in Minnesota.
The ELCA, the largest Lutheran denomination in Minnesota, has taken a stand against the amendment. Brad Frosley leads Calvary Evangelical Lutheran Church in Minneapolis, a congregation with several hundred members.
We don't have to agree or disagree on the morality or the sinfulness or lack thereof of homosexuality to say that we here in Minnesota are going to be a neighbor to all and are going to be welcoming of all people. And I think as Christians, as Lutherans, that's something that's very significant.
This confusing tangle of faith, demographics, and politics make it difficult to sort out just exactly who will be voting yes and who will be voting no in the voting booth. Political watchers say it's all about core values.
You have these competing values that are equally strong, equally valid, but they are not reconcilable.
You probably have 90%, if not more, of the population that's already made up its mind. You're down to probably only about 5 to 10% of the population that's really not sure how they're going to vote on it.
And if you had to vote today, Joyce, would you vote no and leave the Constitution as is? Vote yes and amend our Constitution?
Volunteers at the anti-amendment group, Minnesotans United for All Families, are going after those Minnesotans stuck in the middle.
The single best thing we can do to help somebody resolve their conflict is to engage in a conversation that's respectful, a conversation that really understands where they're at now.
Or are you still making up your mind? Still making up your mind, okay.
And that conversation is actually what leads to people really evolving on this issue.
Minnesota United's campaign manager, Richard Karlbaum, believes there's a growing acceptance across the country for gay marriage, and it's been happening slowly but surely since states began to clamp down on civil unions for homosexual couples in 2004.
As people who at one point never thought about why gay people might want to get married, now understand that it's about love, commitment, and responsibility, the same reason why straight couples want to get married.
That's okay. Thank you for talking to me today. Yep, bye.
Amendment supporters talk a lot about wanting to have those conversations too.
My name's Chris. I'm a volunteer in the Minnesota for Marriage campaign.
And in churches across the state, they're deputizing pro-amendment attendees, providing talking points so they can help spread the word.
People need to be able to respond to when people say, well, this is just an issue of civil rights. Well, how is it not an issue of civil rights?
John Rogers is a volunteer blogger for the Minnesota Catholic Conference's website. His PowerPoint is a blueprint for discussion based on Catholic teachings.
But I think what this is going to at least hopefully let you do is respond when people perhaps charge you with things like bigotry or homophobia.
The big job of convincing the undecided and deepening the understanding among supporters is also taking place on the internet.
Hi, I'm Callie Yanta, and welcome to Minnesota Marriage Minute.
Every week, Minnesota for Marriage delivers a new, finely crafted marriage minute via email to subscribers, anchored by former TV anchor Callie King Yanta. Yanta says she volunteered to be the face for the ads on a news-style set at Northwestern College's media studios in Roseville.
That was an easy yes for me because of my past experience in the media, and I believe in it. Quite frankly, I'm behind it. Massachusetts, it redefined marriage 7 years ago. Have there been any consequences for society because of that?
By Election Day, there will be 45 such marriage minutes carefully outlining the pro-amendment position. But Yanta, a mother of 6, says her support for the amendment boils down to children.
The most compelling argument for supporting the marriage amendment, to me, is to provide an environment that's best in which to raise children, without a doubt.
The opposition can conjure up its own form of star power when it wants to. In mid-August, attorneys from prominent Minnesota law firms gathered to hear brief comments from former Democratic Vice President Walter Mondale and former Minnesota Supreme Court Judge and Republican state lawmaker Kathleen Blatz. Mondale didn't spare his words, calling the amendment mean-spirited, negative, and destructive.
I believe we must unite in understanding that this initiative misuses the amendment process to erode the very promise of our Constitution.
So what is the purpose of our amendment process, and historically, how did we get here? Political Studies professor Larry Jacobs from the University of Minnesota joins us. Larry, let's start on that historical perspective, because amending our Constitution is not something new. Even putting more than one question isn't new. What's new about this?
Well, obviously, this is a very important topic, and so it's gotten everyone stirred up. You look across the country, and this would be the first state, if we decided to reject it, it'd be the first state that has rejected a constitutional amendment on same-sex marriage. So there are a lot of eyes around the country on Minnesota and the possibility that we're going to break the winning streak, at least of those favoring same-sex marriage.
How competitive do you think it is? Because I think for a lot of folks looking at the polls, they've been confusing. They're kind of all over the place. Some of them are partisan, maybe some of them aren't. What are we to make broadly of what it looks like going into the ballot here?
Well, I think at one point we could see the side that was in favor of the constitutional amendment of a marriage between one man and one woman having a pretty significant advantage. There was a poll done in July, midsummer, that showed a 15-point advantage. What we've seen from polls since then is that it's now quite tight. There's about 8% or so who haven't decided. There may be a few more who can move. So this is really a pretty close race.
And is this getting more attention because maybe we don't have a great presidential contest here or Senate contest? Is this the thing to watch politically this year?
This is clearly one of the things to watch. We've got, a presidential race, but so far the Republican presidential candidate, Mitt Romney, has not even opened a campaign office. He's not investing in the state. He came to collect money at a campaign fundraiser, didn't even stop to give even a small set of talks. And then we've got a U.S. Senate race with the incumbent Democrat Amy Klobuchar, by all indications at this point, with a very comfortable lead. So this is a big issue here.
Does it create a motivation problem then for the proponents?
It could become an issue because if we see, let's say, Republicans deciding not to turn out, they just say, why do it? Because there's no one to vote for in president, and the Republican Senate candidate is just underperforming, then that could become a real problem for those who favor the constitutional amendment.
How about the money game? There's a lot of money coming into this.
There sure is. And in fact, when you start looking at the money coming in, pro and con on the marriage amendment, it could be more than what we're seeing for some of the other races being spent in Minnesota. So I think people should strap in. We may not be seeing the ads in the president. We may not be seeing as many ads for the Senate race, but we could be seeing a whole lot of ads on the constitutional amendment.
And we'll be breaking down those ads later in the show. Thanks for mentioning that. How about a little more perspective on the legislative process? Because it is a simple majority to get a question on the ballot, yet we need supermajorities to bond, override vetoes. Is it a lower threshold here than the rest of the country?
Well, it's certainly a lower threshold than a lot of things we do in legislature. You mentioned earlier the governor can veto legislation he doesn't like. He's got no role in this. Once there's a simple majority in the House and then the Senate, it can go to voters. And then when voters have it, it's just a simple majority. of those who are casting a vote. That also lowers the threshold compared to the referenda and constitutional amendment process in other states. So the process, I would say, favors those who want to pass the amendment.
And we'll hear from lawmakers a little bit later in the show, but do you think that may change? There are some bills to make it a supermajority, but is that kind of like unicameral, voting yourself out of power?
You know, I'd be real surprised if the rules changed. There's always the folks who don't like what's happening, who want to change the process. But the reality is the process usually sticks. People don't like to mess with the constitutional process.
Thank you, Professor Jacobs. Appreciate it. One of the reasons positions are so entrenched on this issue is because the debate in our state goes back years and years, and it has been fraught with emotion.
Protesters on both sides of the marriage issue filled the Capitol for years.
Fascism!
Emotions ran higher on this issue than any in memory.
For the first time in 38 years...
Buoyed by a large conservative freshman class, Republicans took control of the House and Senate for the first time in a generation and passed the marriage amendment in 2011.
Their principles are so burned into their soul that it's almost like a religion or a cult.
We are sick and tired of people who don't have their principles burned into their psyche and their souls.
The House floor is where lawmakers bared their souls in deciding.
It's about discrimination.
Some of the kids were actually thinking about hurting themselves because of the way our society treats gays and lesbians.
What I struggle with is the potential of changing the Constitution.
The final marriage amendment vote did not strictly follow party lines.
In my mind, we're starting to talk about discrimination and prejudice.
Hear that out there? That's the America I fought for, and I'm proud of that.
As passionate as those people are outside who you hear right now, there are just as many on both sides of this issue.
And it set up the most pitched battle of this election season in the state, where anger against the amendment turned into resolve.
We are going to roll out of this Capitol and we are going to roll across the plains and prairies of Minnesota, and we are going to show Minnesota who we are. We are a strong people.
But backers of the marriage amendment put a decade of work into getting a vote.
To the Senate floor for a fair and open and honest debate.
It's like holy wars.
Blocking a vote helped take down former Senate Majority Leader and pastor and general Dean Johnson.
This issue of a gay marriage has been the toughest issue I've ever dealt with.
In an era that brought thousands to Capitol rallies laced with religion.
Separate our church and state! Separate our church and state!
Tell the Michelle Bachmans and the Mary Liz Holbergs who we are.
People have really strong feelings on both sides, and I think from the beginning we've never seen this as an issue where we have negative feelings toward homosexuals or where this is being mean to homosexuals or saying that homosexuals are bad people.
The marriage issue also catapulted Michelle Bachmann to Congress and put many state lawmakers for and against it on the map.
How many more gay people does God have to create before we ask ourselves whether or not God actually wants them around?
It is not about hate. It is not about discrimination. It is about defining in Minnesota's Constitution the definition of marriage.
Tonight, we've invited key lawmakers from both sides to talk respectfully about what lies ahead. First, the amendment supporters. Senator Warren Limmer was the author of the amendment. He's a Republican from Maple Grove. House author Steve Gottwald is a Republican who represents St. Cloud in the House. Opposing the amendment, Senator Scott Dibble. He's a Minneapolis Democrat. Rounding out the group is DFL Representative Erin Murphy. St. Paul is her home. Representative Gottwald, I'm going to start with you. I know a lot of you are outdoor knocking. You're in a pretty competitive district. What is the message? I want to hear from everybody here. What is your pitch that you're giving voters on your case for this amendment?
The message to the voters on this amendment, in my mind, is that there is a reason that states are asked to define marriage from a civil perspective. A lot of this gets discussed in terms of religion versus state. And that it is not about hatred, that we can in fact love and respect our GLBT sisters and brothers and stand up for marriage between one man and one woman. And the Minnesotans I talk with really kind of get that. That's where they're at. They don't really hate or feel discriminatory towards gays, lesbians, bisexuals, transsexuals, but they also understand marriage is between a man and a woman. They understand there's a reason for that.
Okay, other side of the aisle, you've recruited a lot of candidates who are outdoor knocking. What is the message they are getting across and you're getting across?
You know, I get the question frequently and had a very long conversation, a 30-minute conversation on a gentleman's porch this last week. And he's still really pondering why on earth the legislature took the time to put these initiatives on the ballot when we need to balance the budget and there are economic issues that we need to work on. So I've heard a lot of dismay and the sense that the priorities are really displaced on the part of the legislature in bringing this issue forward.
Let's head over to the Senate. Senator Limmer, you were there, as we just saw on the tape from the beginning, you know, going back a decade on this. How has the issue changed over all this time?
You know, I think unlike the depictions in the paper, or not in the paper, on the film, I'm finding that the emotion has kind of dissipated a little bit. It's kind of boiled off. And now people are ready for a good discussion. And they're having that discussion. They're having that discussion in the churches and coffee shops around the state. I'm personally finding people that are appreciative of the fact that we have something called a constitutional referendum, and we can occasionally give some of these issues to the public. And they're rather appreciative. Whether they agree or disagree, they're appreciative of the practice of what we have.
This is a very personal issue for a lot of people, and it's especially personal for you, Senator Dibble.
Though that's correct, because of course I'm married in the state of California. I'm a legal stranger to my husband here in Minnesota. And I appreciate that my colleagues feel perhaps authentically and sincerely that this isn't about hate, but it doesn't change the essential fact that this is very hurtful. And this hurts people. And if this amendment were to pass, what it does essentially is it makes it illegal to marry the person you love. And it separates people from the freedoms that are guaranteed in the Constitution for everyone. And that's a fact, and you can't escape that. And it's very harmful, and it does no good for anyone.
How do you deal with the hurtful, the harmful comments?
I think you have to look at the other side of the issue as well. Many people are very concerned that in the event that there ever was a gay marriage acceptance in the statute books of the state of Minnesota, that public policies would have to change as a result of it. And I think there's a great concern among some business leaders that they may have to swallow a conscientious objection of not promoting a gay marriage in order to have their business. Like in some states that we've already seen that have passed gay marriage. Also, you also have the circumstances of public policy. Let's say school curriculums may have to change in recognition of gay marriage. Parents get squeamish enough about just talking about plain old sex education in their public schools, and they get even more locked up when they consider a gay version of that in public schools.
And I know a lot of the messaging around the country has been about children and schools. That's going to be part of the messaging here coming up, isn't it?
Well, I think it's going to be, but I want to comment on something Senator Dibble mentioned. While it may be hurtful, and I recognize that some people take it that way, the intent of this was to preserve something that has existed since the beginning of the state, and for a very good reason. In civil society, when a man and a woman come together, especially in an intimate relationship, there is the potential, not the guarantee, but the potential for a new life. And it has always been in society's best interest that that new life come into a committed relationship. That's the societal reason for having marriage defined the way that it is currently. And I think the fact that they've made this into something where if you vote yes, you're somehow being hateful and discriminatory, and if you vote no, that you somehow love and care about GLBT people, I think is wrong-minded.
I wish we could just replay the tape of what Representative Gottwald just said, because so much of it is true. And the fact is that what this whole discussion about is affirming what we value and cherish the most about marriage and strong families and raising kids in stable environments. And the fact is that same-sex couples are every bit as committed, are every bit as in love, every bit as much are building a life together, but they simply are separated from the freedom to marry each other and provide that stable household for their children. It is proven that kids thrive in strong families regardless of the gender of the parents.
Senator Limmer, why the Constitution? Because you know there is already a law on the books here. You can't get married to somebody of the same sex in our state already.
That law is being challenged in the courts today. Appellate court level, it's already there. They sent it back down to the local level again to reconsider. And that coupled with, first, that alone is a threat to the existing law. And also, you also have the other circumstance where you have legislators that are continually wanting to change the definition to recognize any two adults as married.
Finally, in the legislature, what do you do if this gets on the ballot and you get control?
If we pass the amendment?
Yes, yep. What's the future?
I think that Minnesota is going to continue to have a discussion about what marriage means and what freedom means in America and in Minnesota. And I think that I don't think Minnesotans were asking for this question right now. We were having a discussion about this very quietly. And if this passes, and I sure hope it doesn't, if it does, I think the discussion will continue because it is not right to put into our Constitution a limitation on the freedom to marry.
Thank you, Senators and Representatives. Appreciate it. Our journey to explore what this proposed marriage amendment means to our state now takes us to Greater Minnesota. We found the issue is just as divisive on the Iron Range in Hibbing, but perhaps not as prominent.
In a town where iron ore, Iron Range jobs, and the business it brings is king, the biggest challenge for proponents and opponents of the marriage amendment may be to get the issue on people's radar.
They may have their own private, personal opinions about it, but they just don't want the controversy if they can avoid it.
This married father of five is captain of the Marriage Amendment Committee at Blessed Sacrament Catholic Church in Hibbing, the biggest Catholic parish in northeastern Minnesota with more than 1,500 families. Donna Seba and her husband coordinate education for newly engaged couples in the church.
We want them to understand that how the church looks at marriage.
Like other Catholic churches around the state, Donna said committee members are not only praying about the marriage amendment vote.
We actually passed out marriage prayers that were done by the Archdiocese.
They're working to clear up what they consider to be crucial misunderstandings about the amendment.
We need to speak up and make sure people understand what the amendment means. You know, what a yes means, what a no means, and that you're not taking any rights away from anyone.
From a Catholic point of view, I think marriage is a sacrament. I think it's special. I think it's instituted by God.
The church is sponsoring a series of education sessions and even hosted a community-wide dialogue last June with Protestant clergy from the Iron Range. Local anti-amendment groups applauded their efforts, saying any conversations around the issue are a plus.
We know that when people have conversations about marriage for gay and lesbian couples, it makes them more likely to vote no on this issue.
Just blocks from the church, 26-year-old Jamie Ebert greets a small group of volunteers with her own personal story.
I have two gay moms, and I want their love to be able to be shared and recognized legally as a marriage in the state of Minnesota.
Tonight, Jamie teaches volunteers not only how to talk to voters, but why they're calling.
So that means we need 1.45 million people plus one to vote no.
The campaign has worked to make headway here in Hibbing, in a community that's had little exposure to gay and lesbian people. Ashley Rantala founded the first Iron Range GLBT group 3 years ago.
People used to look longer or say things about our orientation. I don't see that happen as often anymore.
Phone bank volunteers are told the best thing they can do is to share their own experiences.
Oh, so you'd be voting no then? You're certainly not alone on that. All right, well, thank you.
The battle over what really matters here on the Iron Range can be seen on the lawns of Hibbing's residents. Still, both sides seem encouraged their messages are taking hold.
Every time I drive, I see lawn signs that are in lawns of people who I don't know personally, which to me is really awesome.
Feelings about the marriage amendment can run high. In early June, someone defaced this pro-amendment billboard in front of the church. Then the sign disappeared altogether.
There are certain persons who are asking for tolerance that seem not to be willing to extend tolerance to the opposite view.
After November 6th, whatever the results, both sides say they hope they can move forward and continue to live together peacefully.
We're pro-marriage, we're not anti-anything.
I mean, after November, we still want a sense of community.
Don't go away. Our in-depth look at the proposed constitutional amendment that defines marriage in Minnesota continues.
Many of Minnesota's churches have stepped up to take a stand on the issue. Prominent faith leaders will join us in our studios to share their thoughts. Ads on TV and the internet are shaping the battle in Minnesota, but what are they really saying? Experts will help us take a closer look and find out why this vote matters very much to two families on both sides of the issue.
Upon getting married and having kids, we see how much kids need both a mom and a dad.
We want her to grow up in an area where it's okay to have two moms, two dads.
Up to this point, you've heard quite a bit from the experts on both sides. That's why we asked two Twin Cities families to talk about the marriage ballot question and how they feel about it. Our thanks to them for both sharing their stories.
You want to get this one instead? Yeah. Okay.
We have 2 young children, a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and one on the way.
There's a lot of them already.
We just have a blast together every day. We're fully devoted followers of Christ.
Goofing around, the kids, they love that we're silly. That's probably one of the first things they would say about us. You know, we're a silly family.
Right. Make lots of jokes.
Yeah. Different kind, different variety. We met in college, and we lived in the same dormitory, actually.
She was cute. She has the gorgeous red hair, and after being friends for years, we finally got together and then eventually got married. We're supporting the marriage amendment.
For people who support the amendment, not all, but many of them come at it from a faith standpoint, and we've been told your faith doesn't belong in the public square. You're not allowed to bring that in to bear. I don't believe that my faith is something that I can stick in a box and limit to Sunday morning. God designed marriage, and that it's a natural process for a man and a woman to come together and make children, and that is the ideal situation to raise children in.
Both of us were actually on the other side of this issue just even 10, 15 years ago. We thought that this is something that was about fairness and that everybody should have equal access to the word marriage, and we've come to change that.
Everyone has the right to make their own choices of their life and their behavior and to love whom they love, but marriage in the law is about more than just two people coming together and saying they love each other. It's about the greater good for society. It's about the children that are involved. And that's why the government is involved at all. Otherwise, they wouldn't care about who does what with whom.
I think we're going to have a very fun weekend.
If marriage were redefined as a genderless union, it would be as if to say that men and women are the same, or that it doesn't matter if one of those genders isn't present. So my first thought there, well, which is it? Which doesn't matter, the mom or the dad?
It's a sensitive issue, and at the risk of offending people at Thanksgiving dinner or whatever that context may be, I think that's one that's been silent in our families. We haven't discussed it much, if at all.
There are people on both sides of this who are well-meaning, and everyone, regardless of their belief about this, is worthy of love and respect.
I don't think it's too far to reach to say that if marriage were to be redefined in a different way, that potentially my freedom could be limited in that I wouldn't be able to express these opinions. I don't think that that's too far for society to go in our modern age to say that we want diversity, inclusion, and freedom of thought, unless, of course, you disagree, in which case your opinions need to be out of the public square because those are considered hate speech. My opinion is not one that is one of hatred or one of anything that ought to offend somebody. I'm for marriage, and I believe in the family. There's certainly individuals out there that have prejudice or are just flat bigots, and we don't want this conversation to be about hatred. Rather, this should be a serious conversation about what we think is best for children.
I had promised to be single for at least a year and explore the world, and was not actually at all interested in meeting anybody yet.
Okay, I was ready to settle down and meet someone nice.
Oh, good. Throw it over to Mama.
You're not married.
We're
No,
not.
you're not.
We're not married. We can't be married in Minnesota.
Show Mommy. Show Mommy.
The vote this fall doesn't change a thing for us. We still won't be able to go to court and get married. We still won't be able to go to a church and have a marriage recognized in Minnesota. For a lot of reasons, we are against the marriage amendment.
For me, I've lived in Minnesota my whole life, and it's always been a very welcoming state. I've always felt home here. To think that what we know is a sense of community in a welcoming area, to inflict an amendment like this into our Constitution it's just really sad.
We were both raised by really wonderful parents, at least half of whom are themselves pretty conservative. Luckily, I've grown up knowing that there are principled conservatives who have firmly held beliefs, and that one of those beliefs is that freedom means something.
It's not just about us or friends, it's about all of our children. And we want her to grow up in an area where it's okay to have 2 moms, 2 dads, 1 mom, 1 dad. When Erin and I decided to have Ivy, we went through 5 different pastors before we found one that would actually give her a baptism. We didn't do it in a church because they wouldn't allow it in a church.
I've heard people say, oh, we're worried about what's going to happen in the schools. All done. Where our kid's going to go to school and they're going to learn women can marry women and men can marry men. The reality is they're going to encounter kids who have different values every day that they're in school. People should be able to practice their firmly held beliefs. The rest of the society shouldn't come into your church doors and tell you what you can and cannot do, and they can't come into your mind and your heart and tell you what you can and cannot believe. But I think what's different about this situation is that what we're doing is not going into anyone's home. We're not going into anyone's tax status. We're not going to anyone's door and saying what they can and cannot do. But that's exactly what's happening to us.
I also wouldn't tell someone to believe in something else, so I'm not sure why they would tell me why I need to love someone else.
I know that there are many good people out there who are struggling with the issue, and I'd frankly love to have a better understanding of what they're concerned about.
For us to wake up on November 7th and see that this amendment is passed,
it'll be a gut punch. It really will. It will feel very alienating from a state that we love. At the same time, you know, we'll pick ourselves up and dust ourselves off and
go to work.
We'll go to work. We'll pay taxes. We'll drop Ivy off. We'll do all those boring things that we do. But then we need to reframe what comes next.
Children and families are themes widely used in the ad campaigns in the 31 states that have approved marriage amendments. So we're going to spend a few minutes looking at TV spots and online ads from both sides here in Minnesota. Communications professor Kevin Souter from the University of St. Thomas is here, and Star Tribune columnist and editorial writer John Rash is also here to provide some analysis. Well, gentlemen, let's dive right in and start looking at these ads. We're just going to be showing some short excerpts. The first one here is an anti-amendment ad with Governor Ventura and his wife. Let's take a look.
The Constitution's used to protect people. Love is by far bigger than government can ever be. We are the state of Minnesota. We'll make our own decisions, and we know what good values are in Minnesota, and good values are to keep people free. We should defeat this and vote no to show the rest of the United States that nobody influences Minnesotans on what's right or wrong.
Okay, John, what are they trying to accomplish here? Politically, obviously reaching out to independent voters, but what is the ad trying to do?
It's trying to reframe the debate, as much of this entire campaign from either perspective has tried to do. Certainly it is about the marriage amendment, but there's very much a libertarian streak to this argument, and this has run throughout the dialogue with the marriage amendment this year, that it's a personal freedom issue at times as opposed to a marriage amendment issue. And then, as you mentioned, politically, Governor Ventura famously did very, very well with independent voters. He still certainly has some appeal with them. And for the very few who probably are not yet decided on how they're going to vote for the amendment, this may help.
How about the other part of the imagery here, the softer side of Ventura appearing with his wife by his side?
It is a very interesting pairing to put those two on in Minnesota. They have not had a lot of profile here in the state in recent years. And so it's an interesting choice. And in fact, I think that they come across as very soft and very reasonable and thoughtful. And that's not always the image that we connect with Jesse and Terry. But so it's an interesting choice, and they say a lot of things. It's about a 2-minute piece. Going to run online, not over the air, and people's reactions to it, I think, will be in part a reaction to the Venturas and in part to the arguments they present.
Very good. You mentioned that's 2 minutes. There's something for the pro-amendment folks running. They're called Marriage Minutes, and they feature a well-known face here in the Twin Cities. Let's take a look at that.
A second-grade class in Lexington, Massachusetts was subjected to being taught that boys can marry other boys. They were read the book King and King in class about a prince who marries another prince and lives happily ever after.
Former KSTP anchor there, Callie King-Yanta. A lot of Twin Cities folks will remember her. What are they trying to do here by putting an anchor on?
Well, I think that there's an authoritative air to any kind of an anchor, and it's a very smart device that can be used to try to convey information and to some degree in a non-emotive framework. And they're trying to take some of the emotion out of this, which can be a strength when you're trying to put together a particular perspective. It can also be a weakness because some of the other ads from the other perspective do play much more on emotions in terms of the specific appeal, the music, the imagery that's used. And this is much more of a factual, data-driven type of appeal.
Okay, we'll look at one more and then we'll hear from Kevin. Again, it's another Marriage Minute. Let's take a look at this one.
If marriage were to be redefined, there would be consequences for all Minnesotans. These include consequences for religious groups and churches, small businesses, professionals, and individuals. But most importantly, redefining marriage has profound consequences for children.
Kevin, how about this approach? It's a news set, newsy-looking graphics.
Well, as John suggested, that there's the emotional side of this debate, and then there's going to be the more reasonable, logical argument side of this debate. And I think that's what's going on in this side, these kinds of marriage minutes, is they're trying to present some data and some examples about what the world would be like if this amendment is not instituted. So they're trying to bring some, at least apparent logic and reasoning to this debate.
What's more effective in an ad, emotion or logic?
Well, I think it depends on who you are, because there's going to be, I think, a real barrage of emotionally based ads that we're going to see in the 2 weeks prior to the election. And people will, especially those that are persuadable, we're going to see those people reacting to those ads.
Let's get through one more. Against the amendment, Minnesotans United. This is a Republican Catholic couple who have met a gay couple in their neighborhood.
They were the most wonderful neighbors. It taught all of us in our little suburban world.
We did have some good discussions. In our daughter's world, her normal is so much different than ours. It didn't faze her at all.
It's okay to take a second look.
Enter the kids. The children are going to be very powerful images through this.
From both sides, they're going to try to use children as part of the dialogue, and this, in effect, is sending a message for people who may be swing voters in a normal election, as they say in the spot, to think about it again, to take a different look, and then to vote no. And there's also a distinct generational appeal here, and perhaps no issue in American society has a bigger generation gap than this issue, as public opinion polls would indicate.
Yeah, generational and geography is interesting on this
Absolutely.
one. Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it. Well, the Minnesota Council of Churches would like to see more people talk about this issue. Since the spring, the group has been holding a series of 50 gatherings around Minnesota to help bridge the gap between the two sides. They call them respectful conversations.
Our concern was that, as in other places, this decision would be a decision that would happen as a result of TV commercials on both sides. That's not the kind of conversation that's really healthy for a community. We have to understand each other. So we're not out there asking anyone to take any kind of position on this. We're inviting people to come with the deeply held values that they have that bring them to their decision, and to simply share with each other.
The Minnesota Council of Churches represents 24 denominations, including more than 1 million Minnesotans. Although both sides were invited, most participants attending were against the amendment.
I grew up Catholic, and I don't think that makes any difference. I mean, I'm so old that the Catholic Church didn't even talk about it when I was going to school.
I just feel so strongly about it, and I want to know, what am I missing? That people who don't believe what I believe are feeling and thinking.
At first we thought we must have people on the pro-amendment side and the anti-amendment side for these to be valuable. But we find out that they're extremely valuable to the people that are there. People have all sorts of reasons that they've come to where they are on it. And that's been fascinating for everybody at the table to hear.
Tonight, we've brought both sides together to continue that spiritual discussion started by the Minnesota Council of Churches, and they represent many faith perspectives. Pastor Tim Hart Anderson, who leads Westminster Presbyterian in downtown Minneapolis, Dr. Hamdi El Sawaf, the imam for the Islamic Community Center of Minnesota. Bishop Richard Howell with Shiloh Temple Ministries, a Pentecostal assembly in Minneapolis. Rabbi Marcia Zimmerman, who leads Temple Israel in Minneapolis. Father Andrew Cousins, assistant professor at the St. Paul's Seminary at the University of St. Thomas, and Pastor Grant Stevenson from the St. Matthew's Spirit of Truth Community, a Lutheran church in St. Paul. We should also point out he's the faith director of Minnesotans United. Pastor Stevenson, let's start with you, and I'd like to hear from many different people on this, but what is the definition of marriage in your faith, according to your faith?
I'm a Lutheran pastor, and in the Lutheran Church, we emphasize covenant and trust. Marriage is really a relationship of trust between two people, God and the community that is in covenant with those people.
Okay, and Father Cousins, what would you say?
Yeah, as Catholics, our definition of marriage fits very nicely with the civil definition of marriage, which is marriage is a lifelong partnership of love between a man and a woman because they're complementary. And it's also instituted in order to protect the children that come from that union, which is one of the primary goals of marriage.
Okay, so Rabbi Zimmerman, how about you, your definition of marriage in your faith?
So I think what's very important is that we are a tradition of brit, of covenant, and that for me, love makes a family, and that is essential to the growth of every child, that they live in a home that's loving, safe, and a place that they can always return to.
Okay, how about expanding this too? Let's talk a little bit more about how your faith informs your view on this. The two of you.
Certainly, we preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, and we inform the congregants just exactly what the Bible says according to our faith tradition. And we have found it to be very helpful in people to understand the true meaning of marriage defined between a man and a woman.
Okay, and
you look at the scriptures and see a variety of families, and we find that there's helpful guidance in Scripture to help us today define families, but we understand family and relationship in an entirely different way in the 21st century from the way Scripture did so many hundreds and hundreds, thousands of years ago. The context is quite different, and we want to live in our context and understand Scripture as informing us in our time.
Okay. And Mom, how does your faith inform this issue of marriage?
In the teachings of Islam, where the divine laws of God Almighty has been bestowed upon us, we teach those divine laws in conformity with the inspired traditions of Muhammad the Prophet, peace be upon him.
How about this interesting intersection here? We have politics and religion very closely knitted here. How are you dealing with that and the strife it can cause?
Actually, it's natural that there would be an intersect between religion and politics and marriage, because marriage is, of course, something that comes from God, and it's rooted in our human nature. And so we can actually see what marriage is simply by understanding what a human person is and how they're put together. So you find it in the beginning in Genesis, but it also fits very clearly with what human nature can discern about marriage is, that it's one man and one woman in a complementary relationship that's capable of producing children.
It's interesting that in the Genesis text you referred to, Father, there are a couple versions. One of them refers to man and woman being created together in the image of God, and then they're told to go forth and multiply. The second, in Genesis 2, of course, refers to an earthling, Adam, created from the soil, alone. And then God suddenly realizes it's not good that that one should be alone and that that one should have a partner.
And he creates his perfect complement in the woman. And so you have that beautiful moment where Adam stands before the one who was created for him, who complements him perfectly, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And that's what makes marriage.
Pastor.
One of the things that I think that Minnesotans are wrestling with is, so I'm married. My wife's name is Karen. She is the perfect complement for me. For my gay and lesbian friends, I would not be for my lesbian friends, and she would not be. So I think that's actually one of the things that we're talking about in the state of Minnesota now. We know for sure, I think we all agree, that marriage is about a commitment, and it's about taking responsibility for each other. But it's also, in the state of Minnesota in 2012, about everyone having that opportunity, about everyone having that freedom.
Mom, is it dangerous to be linking politics and religion?
No, not at all. Because God has created us, in order to take care of all aspects of our life. And as a matter of fact, in the teaching of Islam, you'll find politics side by side by social issues, economic issues, religious issues, you name it.
And Rabbi, I know that you deal with politics and religion in your home every day, being you're married to a lawmaker, so this is not an unusual thing for you, is it? Yes.
It's how my daughter got into college, was writing her essay about the intersection between politics and religion in her home.
How about on this heated issue, though? How are you dealing with it?
Well, I think, first of all, that we can have this theological discussion, and that is wonderful, that we have differing opinions and differing interpretations. And yet, to put it into law actually is bringing it to a level that worries me, because it cuts off that conversation. And in all honesty, this amendment cuts off my perspective, my point of view, my interpretation, my religious freedom. And that's what I'm concerned about.
Bishop Howell, the word freedom is sometimes used in this, and civil rights. What do you think of those two issues?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I think there's an old saying that says that there is no right that is not rooted in eternal law or natural law. And I think that pretty well echoes that God has the last word on everything we do, even though we like to downsize it to a political issue. But we're dealing with families. We're dealing with society. We're dealing with real people and their feelings. And I think that whatever politics does play, we applaud politics. But the bottom line is, what is the last word?
Father, how do you deal with differing opinions within your faith? There are signs, we've seen another Catholic voting no signs going up, and the Catholic Church has been very active, and there are many Catholics for this too. So there is a definite public divide within the Catholic Church. How do you deal with that?
Well, certainly in the official teaching of the Church, there's no divide or no question on this issue, and we find that when we engage Catholics and we begin to explain to them why it's so important to protect marriage in law, and it's important because it protects children, and marriage is the only relationship that can naturally produce children, and so therefore it needs to be protected. And when we explain that to Catholics, they get it.
How about the rest of you? How do you deal with this difference of opinion? Because obviously not everyone who attends your church or temple agrees with what your personal stance may be or what your faith stance is on this.
I think that's true. I mean, that's actually the point of the Minnesotans United campaign, is that as Minnesotans, we don't agree. So shall the voters and shall the government enshrine one religious perspective in the Constitution? Or shall we vote no and continue the conversation? Because there, in fact, is disagreement.
I'd like to say that, first of all, this is not a campaign against hate. Neither is a campaign against behavior. We're talking about a marriage amendment. And I think sometimes we in the religious community who take the yes position definitely are being accused of being bigots or radicals. And I think that that should be redefined, that we're just simply expressing our opinion according to the Word of God based on this amendment.
Have you had to minister directly to people who have a difference of opinion, and how do you
I have performed
deal with
holy
that?
unions in our church, and I've also dealt with people who are upset about our governing board has taken adopted a statement in favor of marriage equality for all, and that reflected our governing board. It did not reflect everyone at Westminster Church as part of the congregation. So I deal with it all the time. We want to be a kind of a big tent. We want to respect the diversity of God's created goodness, and part of that diversity is these individuals who are gay or lesbian who are created by God. And we want to honor them and give to them the same opportunities for lifelong covenanted relationships of love that bring stability to their family and to our social order. Our denomination in '78 came out in favor of civil rights for same-sex couples in the civil realm. Theologically, we still define marriage as a man and a woman. So we kind of live with this civil and religious divide in our own denomination.
What about another big place, Temple Israel? A lot of folks there, and not all of them can agree on this.
Not all of them can agree, but I do think that, again, our board of directors have made a statement that we do not support the amendment. We definitely understand that there are families in our religious school who come into the sanctuary who have two moms, two dads, and what's amazing, clearly, is that I don't believe God makes mistakes. And I don't think that's a mistake. I think it's a beautiful thing to celebrate.
And Mom, tell us about you, because maybe the media often stereotypes that Muslims have this monolithic way of thinking, but that's not true, is it?
As long as we do have the belief system, it has been explained thoroughly to our people, and we believe in it. It does not mean at all we do not have any discussion. We do have a lot of discussion. We have the open door to discuss a lot of things, but at the end of the discussion, it is totally up to you. This is something between you and God, and you will be held accountable before Him. You are the one who decide for your own. I'm not going to impose anything on you. But yes, we can have a discussion. Yes, we can have an argument. Yes, we can have things. Sometimes even it doesn't come to your mind, but you have to listen to your own people, and you have to find out what is going on, and so on and so forth.
Very good. One final question. We started with talking about the intersection of politics and religion here. Is this a new frontier in America, that politics and religion is going to be forever linked, and that faiths take stances on major issues?
It's as old as the scriptures.
It's as old as time.
Old dirt.
Welcome to our world.
That Adam comes from. It works.
Okay, very good. Thank you all so very much. Well, just a reminder, please remember to vote on November 6th. And don't forget that if you skip the ballot question, that does register as a no vote. And to find more information on how the amendment will appear on the ballot and to learn where to go to vote, you can go to mnvotes.org. That's mnvotes.org. I'm Mary Lahammer, and thank you very much for joining us. Good night.
Funding for Marriage Amendment, I Do, I Don't has been provided by the Bush Foundation.